So how many of you have ever played Monopoly? Played the game Monopoly or some version of Monopoly? Well, one of those spaces around the Monopoly board is free parking. So free parking is really just a space with that doesn't mean anything, according to the rules of Monopoly. But how many of you play that, when you play the game, free parking means you get all the money that's in the middle of the board? How many of you play that way with free parking? Makes the game much more interesting, doesn't it? It's all kind of open to chance, and that money piles up in there, and it's wonderful. But I think that people made their own rules for Monopoly because, it gets a little boring sometimes. You throw the dice, you go around the board, you throw the dice, you go around the board, you buy things, you don't buy things. But life is really a lot like that game of Monopoly. The rules say no one should have an advantage. And yet, we've made our own rule that says, if you land on free parking, you get all this money for nothing, just because of the roll of the dice. So, life is kind of like that. You roll the dice, we land where we are, we're born where we are, we have the parents that we have. Not a whole lot of choices. But then things come along where we do have some choices. But life, as God imagined it, was much like those original Monopoly player designers who said no one should have a special advantage. But we know that God's going to be with us through it all, whatever that roll of the dice, wherever that brings us. And we call that grace. So when the Hebrew people arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai, they were free. They were free. It was now time for them to become a nation of God's people following God's laws. So the Ten Commandments are divinely given to God's people in this context of freedom and justice for all of them. Those laws are sacrosanct. They're not to be changed. They're not to be ignored. In fact, Jewish tradition places such emphasis on those commandments that they're repeated in the book of Deuteronomy. They're often referred to as the Decalogue. And they're the basis of all the other laws that come after that. And if you're familiar with those first 5 books of the Bible, those are all considered the books of law. Expands well beyond those 10 commandments. Eventually, those 10 grew into 613 laws. So we're not going to cover them all today. We're just going to focus on 10. We entitled this week, A Blueprint, God's Blueprint. And I love that image of a blueprint. For those of us who are worshiping here today in this building, we probably remember some of us remember those blueprints. Have any of you built something from the ground up? Maybe built your own home, so some of you have. Some of you have. And some of you may even have been around when the original sanctuary was built. The original building was just the sanctuary, and my understanding is Boker Hall and the classrooms underneath it. So there was a blueprint that created this shell of a building. And then the congregational community decided where the walls were going to go, where the pews were going to go, what the lights were going to look like. The congregation decided all of those things within the shell. So think of the 10 Commandments as a shell. And then the Hebrew people, and then later the Christians, take that shell and make amendments, add to it, remove from it. That's how it works. That's how decisions are made. But think about this building now and the education building. When those additions happen, just like additions to the law and changes to the law, they have to be connected. They have to be congruent with each other. So this building connects to the other building via a breezeway. The education building connects with stairs. And so you put together this whole building with these additions that still follow the original footprint, which is right in the center. And we've tried to make it all congruent with one another. The Ten Commandments, as a blueprint, embrace the love and the justice that God desires for all of God's people throughout the ages. And so today, in the 21st century, 2019, those 10 commandments are still relevant to us. Now, when we used to play Monopoly at home, my cousin would make up some of his own rules, not just with Monopoly, but with almost any game, because he wanted to have a little extra advantage. We might call it a loophole. And so sometimes laws have loopholes. And when they have loopholes, then they need to be changed again to be brought back into alignment with the original plan, which was for equality for all. The Ten Commandments have been so important throughout history that they used to be recited twice daily. And then through the centuries, that changed, and now they're just repeated a few times a year, a few special times during the year. Some argued at that point in time that the Ten Commandments, yes, they were important, but they weren't necessarily so much more important than the other laws, and that the amendments, the things that humans had written to keep them congruent with one another. So there has been this constant concern, which takes prominence, the Ten Commandments or those that have been amended and additions farther on. Well, as much as the Hebrew people have wrestled with those concerns, then along comes Jesus, and things get changed again. Things shifted a little bit, because Jesus reminds us in Matthew 5:17 that he didn't come to abolish the law, he came to fulfill the law. And then he gave us a new commandment, a new blueprint that really is very much in connection to those 10 commandments. In John 13, he reminds us that his new commandment is to love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you're my disciples, if you love one another. So somehow, through time and through amendments, things became more about God's punishment than God's love. And love was always at the heart of what God intended for people. Scripture uses the word fearing God. Well, God didn't want us to be afraid of God. God wanted us to worship God, because our God is an awesome and amazing God. So the blueprint has remained the same for the church, the Christian church, as it multiplies around the world and as the denominations splinter off from one another. And we've had additions, we've had renovations, and in fact, our United Methodist Church has been made from several different permutations of Methodism. If you think about it, African Americans' participation in Methodism began with full inclusion, and then it went to full exclusion, and then it came back partial inclusion, to the point where now we have full inclusion. The rights of women have changed dramatically in Methodism through the years. When it was first starting, women had a very prominent role. And then, like the African Americans, the women lost it. And then in 1956, women were allowed to be ordained once again. So today, fast forward to 2019, and here we are with a question of full inclusion of the LGBTQ community within the life and the leadership of the United Methodist Church. being questioned once again. It's been voted on, and yet it continues to be contested because we're not really certain, all of us, that it fits within that new commandment that Jesus gave us. There still seem to be some loopholes. So the 10 Commandments were written in their present form during the 6th century BCE. Wasn't written right when it was happening. There was no news reporter right on hand writing those things down. 6th century BCE, so much later, when they were in exile in Babylonia, when they had been conquered by the Persians. So here are these Hebrew people who thought they were a nation. Now they're following somebody else's rules again, and they're in exile. And they start remembering, remember how God saved us from slavery, freed us from slavery. Remember how Moses and God had this conversation, and we became one people, and God traveled with us throughout the wilderness. Wouldn't it be great if God came back to help us out of this predicament that we're in? Where is God in the midst of our exile? Well, in the 21st century, here we are, kind of facing a similar time, wondering, where's God's voice in the midst of the chaos and the discord that we experience, not only in the church, but in our country, that seems to spill over into some discord that we're feeling in even our families. Many of us are feeling this kind of sense of dis-ease with the life that we have going on right now. Some yearn for the good old days. But come on, folks. In reality, those good old days, filled with racial injustice, filled with silence among women, inequality in the workplace, inequality, frankly, in most places. Public, civic, religious, not just in the U.S., but around the world. So there's many of us that are looking for something new to be born from all of this. Some might call it a rebirthing of God. So let's take a moment and look at these 10 Commandments once again, kind of revisit them for the 21st century. So on our first slide, there we go. The first 4 are about our relationship with God. They're about how we love God and honor God's presence in our lives. So, I am the Lord thy God, you shall have no other gods before me. Love God more than anything else. Seems simple enough. Don't make any graven images or likenesses. Don't make anything more important than God in your life. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. And we use a lot of different names for God, so don't use any of them in any way other than with respect. Remember the Sabbath day. Well, here we are, remembering the Sabbath day. Honor God by resting one day each week, giving yourself time to worship and give thanks to God. Now, that sounds great, but have you seen my calendar? I know I've seen your calendars, many of you, especially those of you with school-age children. Your calendars don't give you a whole lot of time to take a day for Sabbath rest. Can we honestly say that we don't worship anything more than God? Is that what our lifestyle is demonstrating? Let's focus on how we're in relationship with God, who's freed us from sin and death through Jesus the Christ. What would it really look like if we placed God first in our lives? Now we'll move on to the second half of these 10 commandments, number 5 through 10. These remind us how to be in relationship with one another. So the first 4, how we're in relationship with God. So love God and love others. Second half. Honor your father and mother. Well, I've learned a whole lot from people who are not my father and mother. From many of you, from many people through the ages. So I think what God really wants us to do is to respect everybody's father and mother. Respect our elders. We have a lot to learn from one another. Number 6 is don't commit murder. Don't hurt anyone or anything. Well, I'm willing to bet that most of you would say you haven't committed murder. But we may not think about it so much because we haven't picked up a gun or a knife, unless maybe we've done something while we're in service. But most of us haven't had the opportunity to commit murder, or so we think. Well, what about if something we do affects someplace else in the world and death happens because of that? Might be something that happens that we've done to creation, might be something that we've done unknowingly, probably is unknowingly, and yet we can be complicit in those deaths. The 7th one is don't commit adultery. Be faithful to your marriage partner. Well, think about what that really means. If we're not faithful to the person we claim most to love in this whole world, then how can we be expected to be loyal and loving of God or anyone else? Don't steal anything that's not yours. Don't lie. Tell the truth. Don't covet your neighbor's stuff. Be happy with what you have. All 3 of those things can lead us to be separated from God and from one another. The blueprint's right there in Exodus 20. So, what are we going to do about it? What changes do we need to make to our lives, not just our individual lives? Because remember, God was talking to a community, this whole community of Hebrew people. Jesus was talking not just to those disciples gathered around the table, but to all of us. So what are we going to do to make our lives more in line with what God gave us through Moses and through Jesus the Christ? As we go into this week, I'm suggesting that we all might want to take a closer look at who we are and how our relationship with God and with others is playing out. Maybe we can make some changes. Maybe we need some refocusing. So let's take a moment now to pray. Covenant God, you brought our ancestors out of slavery in Egypt. You've continued to free us from things that enslave us. Let us remember to be your partners in this world. Let us remember to be in right relationship with you and with all your children. Guide us along that path, the path of love, the path of justice, the path of peace. Amen.